Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Survey and Spatial webinar, Employer Obligations During Lockdown. Thank you all for joining us today. We just want to give you a heads up that there have been issues with our presenter's IT this morning. So if by any chance we lose connection during this broadcast, we will be pre-recording the presentation again and sending the link out to you early next week. So hopefully we can get through the whole broadcast, but as I said, there have been IT issues this morning, so it's just a heads up for you. I'd now like to introduce you to our presenter, Renika. She is the Executive Director at McCaw Lewis Lawyers and leads the firm's workplace law team. She has worked with a range of clients on employment matters in the Authority Court and at mediations advising on personal grievances, health and safety matters and other disputes. Her focus across all employment matters is on manakitanga in the workplace as a basis for good process and relationships. With a background in treaty settlement matters and Māori iwi governance, getting the documents and governance right from the outset is also a focus. She also advises clients on restructures, including redundancies and commercial transfers, and is a regular presenter at numerous EMA conferences and in other forums. Renika also holds a number of external governance roles across the Waikato. So welcome, Renika.
Thank you, Jenny. And again, apologies in advance if there are IT difficulties, because I've had a little bit of a morning of IT issues and combined with a cat and a 9-year-old. So probably things that you're all experiencing at home yourselves during the lockdown. This session is focused on tips for employers, and I think perhaps in the blurb that got sent out, there was some comment around subsidies and things. I'm happy to touch on those, but as I worked through what was probably most important for people in the current level 4 lockdown, I thought probably some of the things we wanted to talk about or might have questions on is around vaccinations, masks, and what we do either as essential services working at the moment or as we hopefully move down through the levels. So managing those alert levels, what to do in a health and safety sense, and then of course going back to the age-old questions around changing working arrangements and redundancies, which apply across the board, but we find that a lot of people are asking those questions in COVID times. So please do feel free to send through questions as we go, and I'm happy to either incorporate them into the session. Jenny's going to feed them through to me as we go, or we'll have time hopefully at the end. So I guess to start, hopefully this is something that you've all heard for the last at least 18 months, I guess, that employment law is not cancelled during COVID. So those obligations that we have around good faith, both for employers and employees, still apply. All the things we did before as good employers should still happen. They're just going to happen a little bit differently. So I've got there on the slide, employers need to be maintaining frequent communications with their staff. And hopefully you would have seen yourselves from doing that in the last week or so, there's a lot of uncertainty across the country, and particularly in this current lockdown where we're not certain that here's a 4-week lockdown. We're waiting week in, week out for those updates and movements and alert levels. Ensuring that we have comms around what each alert level means for staff, what is on the horizon for your team as we move through those alert levels. That's a really important part of just being a good employer and hopefully nipping some of those issues in the bud before they become, queries or concerns for your staff. So making sure that as you're moving through, obviously, a lot of financial decisions around COVID and how that's impacting, the core business side of things, think about how that's impacting your staff. And I know that's easy for me as a lawyer where my main business is people and the staff are at the core of our business. We need people to provide advice. But I think that does apply across the board because if for nothing else, then having issues with your staff and having to deal with those matters while you're dealing with everything else in COVID is probably just the last thing that you need. So working with your employees to find solutions, and the more you communicate through COVID, the easier, hopefully, it's going to be to do that. So good faith is important, and teamwork. I don't want to sound like Jacinda, but we're all in this together, so the more we can communicate, the better. A hot topic, of course, at the moment, and which emphasises really the need to be on the same page with your teams, is vaccinations and masks. So in terms of the vaccine, we know that the government is encouraging people to get vaccinated where they can to assist with managing the spread of COVID. But obviously there are different views on vaccinations, some more staunch than others in those views, but inevitably the question then becomes, can we require our employees to get vaccinated, particularly in the context where the government is advising everyone to get vaccinated and recommending that as one of the key steps to fight COVID. So my first bullet point there is no, you can't generally require your employees to get a vaccine. There are, of course, exceptions for specific health and safety reasons. And the best example of that is our border workers, where they need to be vaccinated for health and safety reasons, because not being vaccinated poses a risk to them and to those who come in contact with them. So where there are those genuine health and safety reasons to require someone to get vaccinated, that is okay. But generally speaking, in an office setting, perhaps we can't require our employees to get vaccinated. You might have heard over recent days that there's been some discussions coming out of the government around what that looks like going forward and whether they would require all of New Zealand or all workplaces to be vaccinated. They've indicated at this stage that that's not going to happen beyond the rules that are in place at the moment for border workers. But there is this question mark out there over whether you can make it a requirement for new staff. Can you say, if you want to work here and you want to apply for this job, you need to be vaccinated? So the jury's still out on that one. The suggestion is that that is possible, but I think what the key flag there, if you are considering that, is why do you need that to be in place? Why would you need to require someone to have a vaccine in your workplace, and could it lead to unfair discrimination against people and coming into your business? And part of that is around the fact that we know the vaccination doesn't actually stop COVID. It doesn't stop you from getting COVID or necessarily passing it on. So in that circumstance, to say everyone in the office needs to be vaccinated so that we cannot get COVID or cannot pass it on is probably an unrealistic expectation given what the experts are saying. Down from that, can you ask if staff are vaccinated? And I've kind of pondered on this myself in the last few days, because certainly a lot of our team are letting each other know when they're going to get vaccinated, and we've absolutely allowed people to take the time during the day and be flexible when they're working from home to get vaccinated. I think the answer to that question lies in what are you going to do with that information? So yes, you can ask staff if staff are vaccinated, but they are entitled to refuse to answer that question. And again, the difference might come in border workers or those who are in the medical profession and really have health and safety reasons to know that, in particular government orders. But generally speaking, yes, you can ask, yes, you can encourage your staff to get vaccinated as long as they are able to refuse or refuse to tell you the answer, and there's no unfair treatment for them. Interestingly, I saw someone on LinkedIn the other day who was sending a box of donuts to all of their staff that got vaccinated. And it just made me ponder whether or not that, how that might be looked at for those that aren't getting vaccinated. And no comment on that. I would love to receive a box of donuts, but I think it's just for your circumstance, reflecting on what's going to come from that through that different treatment. And then mask wearing. So we know that the government has put in place new rules around masks in the last week, and making masks mandatory in a number of workplaces and work events. So starting point is, if there is a government order that masks need to be worn, then yes, you can absolutely require your staff to follow those government guidelines, and that would be absolutely reasonable of you as an employer to do so. There is, of course, as we know, people that have medical exemption from wearing masks, and if they do, then you would be entitled to get the supporting information and the medical certificate or whatever it might be to see why they can't wear masks. So I think that's important in terms of how you communicate that and the environment that you create, which is, we have to wear masks, so we do. But if you can't, please let me know, and we can make sure that there's no discrimination against you for that. Had a discussion with my husband last night to, around if we were those people that couldn't wear masks, certainly there would be some insecurity going out into public. And I made the comment that I would definitely have some email proof on hand, because I'd be walking around into the supermarket, being very mindful that people would be looking at me and thinking, why aren't you wearing a mask? So I guess there, for some who are in that position, there will be perhaps some shame in it, or embarrassment and guilt in not being able to wear a mask. So looking after our staff who are in that situation is important. But yes, you can force staff to wear masks, and if they refuse to follow those requirements, then that can be an issue for disciplinary investigation and action potentially. Generally, with health and safety, I would say you need to be aware of all of the government guidelines and the WorkSafe guidelines or guidance that applies to you. And that is changing. We know that Alert Level 4 now is a bit different to Alert Level 4 previously, and the government and the experts are saying that Delta is almost like a different virus. So when you're preparing a COVID-19 safety plan, I think you need to be mindful of those frequent changes in the government guidelines, so that you can give your staff enough certainty around what to expect and what to do from a health and safety perspective. But at the same time, you have the flexibility to adjust for those guidelines. And so keep checking in and keep on top of those things. When you're making your safety plan, all I would advise is to make your best efforts around health and safety. Do what you can, because it won't be perfect, but think of all the things that apply to your business, your workforce, from a health and safety perspective. And when you're making those rules, be genuine, be realistic, and do what works for you in line with those guidelines. Because I think if you don't do what works for you, then you run the risk of not being able to follow your plans. And that is when we all, in any situation, are at risk of challenge from employees who might feel hard done by in these things. So when you're looking through a safety plan and a COVID-19 plan, know that will probably be different or adjusted from last year's plan. And it wouldn't hurt to look at the 7 questions on the WorkSafe website and any other guidance that's out there. Talk to other people in your industry and see what they're doing to take the bits that work for you. If you are lucky enough to be working from home, like me, then know what that looks like for you. So checking in on people's home setups. Although it looks like I'm in a dungeon with this dark lighting, I really do have sufficient light, and I just unfortunately have a new laptop that wants to adjust for lighting in an unhelpful way. So know what people's setup looks like. Send out questionnaires because you can't obviously go and inspect that. And beyond the physical things, obviously making sure that from a mental health and wellbeing position, you're checking as well. Because I know certainly we have staff who have children running around and are struggling to get the hours done. And it's not going to be that productive for them to be up at 7:30 with the kids and juggling kids and work all the way through till 10 o'clock at night. So have those discussions. And that really brings me to my next slide, which is around managing leave and managing some of those discussions that we need to have with staff when they're in a tricky position and working from home or not working at all if they're unwell. So one thing that's come up a bit in the COVID scenario is around sick leave, because sick leave technically only applies if you are sick or if you're looking after someone who's sick. And so if you're isolating because you're a close contact or in a household of someone, but you're not sick and don't have any symptoms, technically sick leave won't apply. But as I've noted down there on the slide, that can be changed by agreement. So I would recommend being flexible around that as an employer, but knowing that's the starting point. In terms of annual leave as well, a lot of people trying to make their staff take annual leave. Just be aware that you can only make or require your staff to take annual leave with 14 days notice. But again, that can be changed by agreement. So if you're in good communications with your team and they understand the parameters for your business, it's going to be easier to have that discussion around what's needed and how they can help in terms of taking leave. And they should come to that as employees. They should come to those discussions in good faith, just as you will, to see if there are solutions that work for all. And whilst hopefully everyone's aware of the subsidies that are out there to assist with managing leave and different works scenarios, just do be aware of them. So even if you think that you're not in a position at the moment where you're down on revenue or likely to be, or if you think it's unlikely that you would be affected by someone needing to be in isolation for 14 days, it doesn't hurt to have someone in your team have a look at the subsidies that are available and just have them there in case difficult situations or unique situations crop up where you can actually utilise those things to assist yourself and assist your staff. A couple of tricky scenarios are coming out of the woodworks, and my husband works in a relatively large national business that sees a lot of these things where they are essential workers, and they have a mix of people who can work from home, but people who need to be in the stores or in the warehouses working. So a couple of the ones that come up, and please do send through questions about any specific scenarios that you've seen. But I guess the starting point is where there's just no work available under level 4, where level 4 and potentially level 3 means that you cannot provide your staff with work. So hopefully what a lot of people would have done after last lockdown was to have processes and policies in place that are signed up to by their staff governing these things. But if not, I would advise that the first step is to have the discussions with your staff. And obviously we're at day, probably working day 8 or something of this current level 4 lockdown. And so you would have dealt with all of those things already. But the longer that these alert levels go on, the harder it is to manage in some respects, because people may be able to manage paying everyone for a week with no work. But if you have to pay everyone for 4 weeks with no work, then that becomes tricky. And that's, I think, where you need to be as honest with your staff as you can be around the business's financial situation, things that you're looking at, and what would really help to keep their jobs. Because if you can have those discussions with the absolutely clear intention on your part as employers that you want to keep the business afloat, successful, and keep their jobs open longer term, then hopefully in good faith, those employees will come to the party around either reduced pay, just being able to take the wage subsidy, or taking a mix of wage subsidy and leave, for example. So I would say that there is no clear answer there, because whilst this has been in part through the courts, there are so many nuances there that I think the only clear advice I can give is to have discussions and to not say to anyone, right, we're in level 4, we have no work, and tomorrow you won't be paid until we can come back into the office. Another scenario there, which we've, I think, seen a lot about in the media of late, is people being able to work from home, technically. So like me, I can work from home, but they're unable to complete all the usual tasks. And a perfect example of this might be a receptionist who's usually busy helping clients or customers and tidying rooms in a physical environment. But when they're working from home, the phone calls might be few and far between. And also those other tasks won't be able to be easily done, especially those physical ones that they need to be in the office for. So again, I think that requires discussion and is a perfect example of when you just need to be a bit dynamic in your workforce, but also honest with the conversations from the beginning, because it may be that over time, if a lockdown continues, there will be discussions around needing to temporarily reduce their hours and make changes to their working arrangements, which I'll talk about shortly, how to do that. Other examples there around essential workers who do need to be at work but have no childcare for their children. Obviously now most of you will be aware that there is childcare arrangements in place throughout the country, but that is difficult because it's not necessarily every environment, and it could be new, somewhere new for your children to go, and that won't work for everyone. So again, I would just say approach that with in good faith, with open communications. But ultimately there is that there. So if I take the very harsh employer perspective, you can require your essential workers to be at work where they can now get childcare for their children. Essential workers who need to isolate, again, I would just encourage you to look at the government subsidies around that. and also look at what other tasks they might be able to complete from home. And it would be in good faith and certainly reasonable for an employer to ask essential workers who need to isolate to have a little change in their tasks temporarily, if that is what is possible and what will help the business, but also help that essential worker keep themselves busy and able to be paid while they need to isolate. So those discussions, I think, are absolutely reasonable and fair to have. The fun one is where an essential worker simply refuses to work at level 4 for health and safety reasons. And that does happen. And some people, unfortunately, are difficult and may not have genuine health and safety reasons for that. So as an employer, all you can do is consider that refusal and the reasons for it. Ask for as much information as you can around why they are refusing to work at level 4, and then consider the health and safety, the genuine health and safety implications of that. And if their concerns around health and safety are not valid and or can be addressed by you, then you can require them to work, assuming that's all within government guidelines, of course. And if they refuse to work for no good reason, then you do not need to pay them. Just like someone who says, I'm not coming into work tomorrow and I've had no leave applications, etc. You don't need to pay them because they're not doing what they're contracted to do. Just had a question come through, so I'll read it out and answer as we go, but the question is, if 10 to 20% of your staff cannot work under level 4 because their roles require them to be in the office or working on site, what is an equitable policy to support these staff compared to those who continue to work full-time? So that might be an example of people who do need to be out in the field, or people like receptionists who need to be at work. I think the reality is, and hopefully you can have these discussions within your workplace, and it might be made easier given that this is not the first lockdown we've had, to have those discussions to ask them what they would be willing to do, because it might be different for everyone. So having a policy which enables the different options, so it enables the discussion and enables the different options for people, which may be that after a certain period of lockdown, you would need to consider reducing hours to, 50% of their usual work, but allow them to top that up with annual leave if they have it. So this will be different for everyone. So that's a suggestion and would be different based on the type of work and how those staff respond. And I would think as well that those policies would need to be fairly regularly revisited, because as I think I said before, it's all good and well to have something that works for 1 week or 2 weeks that you may be able to manage. But if lockdown or level 3 lockdown, even alert level 2, depending on the rules around that, which might be in place in future, if that continues for 6 weeks, 2 months, beyond, that might not be realistic or manageable. So having the flex, having time frames or other milestones in your policies to allow those discussions to continually happen, I think is important. And a key tip for that would be not to necessarily link those policies to specific levels, because level 3 may continue for 8 weeks. And you might have thought at the time of making the policy that level 3 would surely only happen for 2 weeks. So something that's made with absolute best intentions now may not work in the very near future. And so enabling, I think, just being as transparent and as honest with your staff as you can be will hopefully enable them to come to the party. And ultimately knowing that if we can't find policies and things that work for everyone, then you're in a situation where you do need to probably look at whether you can keep all those people on. And I think keeping people in jobs in a long-term sense is certainly going to be key for us all, hence the wage subsidies and things that apply. I think just before going on to this point, which links into the last ones, to that question, if there is a wage subsidy available, then as employers, I do think you owe it to your staff to explore whether you are eligible for those wage subsidies before making any changes to work arrangements, and certainly as part of those discussions and policies around changing specific people's pay. If you're not eligible, then that is all you can do, but certainly to be able to say to your staff, we've looked and we've done the math, and unfortunately we can't apply for anything, I think that is important and goes a long way to showing good faith. So when you do change work arrangements, this applies in COVID or not, but when you do change work arrangements, it's not a matter of just telling your employee that things are going to change, because the changes to your hours or pay will generally require a written agreement unless of course, there is a restructuring or redundancy going on with a proper process. But those changes to work arrangements could be very unique in a COVID context. And so I think what we were just talking about, a mix of reduced hours, possibly having annual leave, or changing tasks. So I've been trying to think through a big list of what our receptionists can do that is possibly a little bit outside the box, or she wouldn't usually do. Maybe some of our EAs would do usually, or our marketing team. So trying to find things that people can do that are still helpful to the business, but perhaps in the normal course of events wouldn't have happened, is helpful and is important, I think, in these very unique times. And I think there's other things around either taking unpaid leave. If you really cannot afford to have a staff member paid to do no work because the situation is that dire, then I think it's important to have those discussions, and rather than jump straight to a redundancy, consider whether they could take unpaid leave until the end of a lockdown or a certain point in time when you would reconsider that, because a lot of people may be struggling with things at home anyway and would rather have the security of a job in 2 months' time than and not be paid now than take some lump sum payment for their 4 weeks and then not have a job. So think about those things, and obviously if you're getting the wage subsidy, whether that can just be passed on directly after those discussions that you have. There's another question that's come through in terms of whether a one-size-fits-all change, so one approach for all staff, but is that the strongest legal basis, or has the ERA favoured individual case-by-case agreements for each staff member? And I think the key there, and knowing that not that many have gone through to the authority out of this, partly because mediation is a mandatory first step, and so people sort things out there, and some people don't have the money, especially if they've been laid off, to carry on to the ERA. But I think it is very case specific. So what you need to demonstrate if you are making a across-the-board change or a one-size-fits-all staff is whether there is a genuine business case for that, because it's just the same as any other restructure where you need to have genuine business cases and you need to have looked at all other options. So the key is not necessarily the outcomes of that and whether it's a one-size-fits-all or individual case-by-case arrangements, but whether you have followed the process properly and come to a conclusion that is fair and is based on genuine business reasons. So you can see a situation where someone absolutely has enough work to do and will still be profitable, but their pay or their work is proposed to be cut by 80% to pick up the slack for other people. In a case-by-case basis, that person may be successful. So I think you have to be mindful of those risks as well. And the key will be going through your financials and ensuring you've considered those opportunities and primarily given people options in terms of those discussions. So just noting there that when we do change them, and I think my next slide is on restructuring itself, but when we do change them, those arrangements can't be less than minimum legal requirements. So if you're reducing someone's salary but not their hours of work, just be mindful that that can't go under minimum wage. So reflect on that and whether that is instead a reduction of hours rather than wage is probably most appropriate. And record your arrangements carefully and in writing. Obviously, this is an emotional time, a stressful time for a lot of people, both on the employer and employee side of things. And sometimes we don't always remember things clearly or the same when we're in that position. So think about whether this is just a fixed term variation, i.e. are your hours just changing for the next 2 weeks and then we'll revisit. So what is the end point there? And don't stress about needing a lawyer to draft up some fancy variation for your IEA. It can be in an email as long as there's clear acceptance from both parties and it's really clear what is being varied and the basis of that. Always pays to have a paper trail in case one day you do unfortunately need a lawyer. Just a comment through there from someone as well that a variety of tasks is also good for professional development and strengthens your business continuity as well, which I would absolutely agree with. And I think it also strengthens our culture internally and our ability for people to support one another and help other people with their tasks at times that they might be struggling. So, and as well as that gives those people who are doing and picking up new jobs, hopefully if they're good employees, makes them feel like they're still contributing and still part of the team, especially when everyone around them might be quite busy in their roles. Another question here, could your final accounts at the end of the financial year be required by a staff member as proof of the business case put forward? So ultimately, and this ties into the restructures and redundancies, if in any situation you are relying on a financial reason for a restructure or redundancy, then yes, the affected employees will be entitled to relevant financial information, the stuff that you said you were basing your decision on. In terms of financial accounts at the end of the year, I think that's probably a bit of a stretch too far because you will be making decisions on the information you have at the time. And I think that's a really key one because I'll give the example of one of the sporting entities that I work with. And at the time of COVID hitting, you really don't know what is going to happen. And there's a lot of uncertainty in the sporting world around whether events can go ahead and gaming funds and things like that, which are your key revenue. So it's absolutely reasonable to change some of those forecasts in a very considered way and make the assessment that off the back of that information, you don't have roles for people, or you need to change people's working arrangements on a temporary basis. It may be that at the end of the year, following COVID lockdowns, etc., and based on how long they last, that position changes. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the business case or the reason you had at the time of making those decisions was wrong, was unfair, or unreasonable. So no, generally speaking, they wouldn't be able to request end-of-year accounts. But if you are using a current financial reason to justify those changes, then they should be entitled to some of that information in a current sense. So I know that a lot of information may be sensitive, may be confidential, but to the extent that you can share some or say, this is what we're looking at, we do not have work this week. For my business, I can say, hey guys, our hours or our work that's coming in is significantly down this week. Look, this is what we've forecasted it at. You all know you do or don't have very much work, and that has an impact on the bottom line. And I think those discussions are important to have so that any financial decisions don't come out of the blue. In terms of those changes, just knowing that if you are forcing changes because hopefully only because you've been unsuccessful in getting agreement on things, if you are forcing those changes, they are considered a restructure. And with any restructure, you do need to have a genuine reason for it, as we've just talked about, and carry out a proper consultation process and seek feedback on that. I think in a COVID context, as we saw last year, there are some differences to that because people will know what COVID means, and it is often easier to explain to people that there is a financial downturn as a result of essentially closing shop for many. So that will be easier to justify and explain, but it's still important to go through those processes. And there may be really not much that they can provide in terms of feedback, but important still to hear that from them, because they might say to you, can I please take 4 months of unpaid leave and you come back to me and I'll keep my job, but I'll just be on leave. Is that a possibility? So those things could be considered and could come out of that process. That is me in terms of my slides, and I've tried to answer the questions as we've gone through, but there may be more that come up, so happy to answer anything else, and equally happy to let you all get back to your day and children who you might unfortunately be homeschooling. I found that my 9-year-old sings a lot all day, so I'm not sure how he manages at school.
Thank you very much, Renika. That was a great presentation. It was good to see the engagement from our members who are online. It doesn't look like we have any further questions for you, but I'd just like to say to our members online, if any questions do pop up after this broadcast is finished, please email them through to me, Jenny at surveyspatialnz.org, and I will forward them on for a response. So once again, everybody, thank you so much for your time. And Renika, thank you very much for your presentation.
No worries, everyone. Keep safe. Thanks, Jenny.